Hello once again, everyone. So, welcome to another episode of the series I have finally given a name, which we're going with moveset breakdowns. Kind of combine two good suggestions. Disappointing my parents was another one that was in the running. But either way, today we're going to be talking about two characters that have a bit of a link in that they are both showcasing someone who is particularly strong, but also there's a little bit more to it than that that links them. So what we're going to be going over today is going to be the Conqueror and the Raider. Now, I'll be starting off with the Raider. The reason I wanted to put these two together is because while they are both definitely strength-based characters, with the Raider being a vanguard and the Conqueror being the first heavy of the team, both of them also showcase unique aspects that go beyond their use of just brute strength. The Raider is obviously one of the taller of all of the fighters, one of the larger, and certainly showcases some of the most muscle, but there's a little bit more to him, a certain aspect of speed that is actually not appreciated in, I think, a way it should be. And the Conqueror, meanwhile, has some other indications about his backstory and the way he maybe learned how to fight, which I will also be going into. But if you haven't seen the show before, I need to stop calling it that. But anyway, if you haven't seen this before, basically the idea is that we are going to be taking movesets of these characters, breaking them down and talking about what makes them tick and what they're showing us, occasionally talking about what historic techniques may appear in their weapon usage. So we're not going off realism. I may mention it from time to time, but I'm not going to be talking about how spinning is a bad idea. But anyway, so first and foremost, I'm using just a simple light poleaxe trainer in place of a Dane axe because I don't have a Dane axe. And proportion-wise, this is decently close. The Raider's axe, I think, is almost as tall as he is, so this really isn't that far off. Now, firstly, let's talk about the way the Raider stands. And that's kind of an interesting one because there's more to his character in his normal walking around than there is in his actual stance. So the Raider pretty much always keeps dominant hand up close to the head and then non-dominant kind of placed equally down the haft. And he's always kind of keeping it here. Now the reason I bring this up is because if you look at the Raider's walking animation, he's got very sort of shoulder forward sort of position, which tends to indicate a bit of tenseness. I mean, it could be that he just is slightly rolled forward in his posture, but what I think that is, it's him being not necessarily on edge, but a little bit maybe. I mean, if you look at it, for example, this is me just walking casually, I'm not terribly worried about anything, versus if I start emulating the Raider, it looks a lot more kind of gamey, right? So, the other reason I bring that up is because if you walk long enough, eventually he starts to look around. He will mostly keep his eyes forward, but after a little bit he will turn and kind of look behind him and then keep going. So, bear that in mind, it will be coming up again later. Now when it comes to his actual stance, he's pretty simplistic. He's got high, high, he will switch hands, low, low. Now, his general posture is a pretty wide stance. His left foot is in front if he's on this side, right foot in front if he's on this side. He holds the haft relatively high, not necessarily as high as the Lawbringer, but definitely up there. When he's low, he's got a bit of a hunched forward posture, so if I show it from the side, he's very much kind of hinged at the hip and his head is much more forward. In general, this isn't a wonderful idea since with my weapon behind my head, I have to move it out to guard, but it's nothing too crazy. He's kept very low, very sort of cagey style fighting that you see in also the Berserker, so there's a little bit of linking there between the faction. Now, his general movement, when it comes to launching his lights, he will not pass forward. He will instead do a small step with whatever foot is in front. And much like the Berserker's lights, these aren't terribly heavy hits. If I'm here and I go to do a side light, he's just going to quickly chop down with the blade, crossing himself up, but he's also not passing forward before returning back. So all that is just whoop, and he's back, or alternatively on the other side, just a quick little jab, nothing crazy. This seems to be best used against a farther out target, taking a hand, hooking a shield, something along those lines. When he attacks from the top, again, we're going to pretty much just see a quick little cut down, again, no passing step. Now, when it comes to doing multiple lights, we will see him hit, rather than, if he decides to go from the other side, he's going to turn around, but if he comes back from the other side, he will switch hands. So you'll have a bit of a boom, boom kind of thing. If he switches, you will see boom, he will turn, and then strike again. Oftentimes, you're not going to see all three lights together, so it's usually going to turn into light then heavy. And for the most part, his basic light swings are nothing to write home about. It's just cutting. Now, this form of cutting is not necessarily something that doesn't appear, but in general, not a great way to open a fight. It puts you in a very kind of off-balanced position. It doesn't really reach all that far striking-wise, so usually the only time you'd use this is if you're trying to quickly hook something, or if someone has completely messed up their distance. Dunno. But when it comes to his heavies, that's where things get a little more interesting. Now, as I talked about in the last video, most characters, when it comes to them launching their heavies, especially if they're using a bladed weapon, they seem to just hit harder. However, the Raider is one of those that adds a little bit of a little more nuance into it. So, for example, this is his side light. When he goes to do a side heavy, he will release with his top hand and let the blade sort of go out more. Now, the reason he's doing that is because, of course, it gives him more reach. He's also doing essentially what he'd be doing if he's using the axe in his spare time. And for sure, we know that the Raider does a decent amount of wood chopping. We see him do it in the campaign. Mentions it, one of his executions is just straight up a log split, so that's not all that crazy. So that sort of sliding down of the lead arm while using a strike, not at all strange. So let's take a look at that, shall we? So for example, we're going to do a light and a heavy. We're here, light, then to go into the heavy, you would step, and go ahead and swing it through. Now, it should be noted that oftentimes if he does three heavies together, it will usually be at kind of the end of his rope, like I'm showing here. It'll be at full extension, especially if you swing from the side. He's basically all the way out here, and he just kind of brings it across. Now, there's a little bit of off-balancing that he puts himself into, and you can see him recover from it, especially on his final side heavy. He will end up basically right here. Not a great place to be, but you kind of see him, he'll have his way forward, he'll stop himself before coming back into a fighting position. Now the reason that's happening is because he's throwing a lot of his weight behind those heavies. This is not the same heavies as the Kensai, nor is it the heavies of the Lawbringer that we'll be talking about when we eventually get to him. This is very much, he is putting everything into those swings in hopes that he hits and finishes. Now, when he swings from over the top, again, nothing out of the ordinary that you wouldn't expect. He raises up, brings down, right? Oftentimes, when I play the Raider, we'll get someone between us and just, we call it hi-ho, right? Because it's off to work we go. Nothing crazy there. Now, he does swing all the way through on these strikes. He's bringing it all the way till it hits the floor or whatever it catches in the middle. Doesn't particularly care. Like I said, not a whole lot of craziness in the moveset so far. It's just swinging an axe. And for certain, his axe head has got a lot more weight to it than most historical Dane axes have. This is both obviously visible in his design as well. This doesn't represent it as well, but most of his axe heads have a swelled back that is kind of hammer-like. This is, I think, because he's using probably more of a splitting axe than an actual Dane axe with his default head at least. Some of the other heads look a little bit more war-suited, but his initial head, I'm pretty sure, is just basically a splitting axe put on a long haft. Now, his other sort of tricks. His area attack / his charged up heavy. That's a really fun one. That one, essentially what he's going to do is he's going to kick it back and really swing through, usually going kind of all the way around. Nothing terribly crazy. All he's doing is from here, he just goes down to the very, very end and will swing through until he finishes it. I can't remember if he turns all the way around or not. I don't think he does. I think Shigoki does. Anyway, though, nothing crazy there. If he does it on the other side, it should be noted it usually takes a little bit longer because he has to transition hands most times. Especially if he's up here or from above, he usually transitions before swinging horizontally, which is a cool thing they added, but it takes more time. Now, again, nothing crazy so far. Let's talk about his stunning tap. So the stunning tap is probably one of the more useful things in his toolkit, actually. I say this because last time I got to play around with some Danaxes, they were synthetic, so safe to spar with. I tried it out, and it just took the other guy completely by surprise, and I bopped him right in the face. So there is something to be said for it, but essentially all he's going to do is either from here or what have you, he's going to just dash forward and do a quick pop with the pommel. So here's that from the side. So we're here, going around. Whoop. Nothing crazy. Now once again, he is putting his weight into it rather than just extending out or anything along those lines. He is actively throwing his weight forward into it. So what we've seen from a lot of this is that for his lighter hits, he seems to be a relatively conservative fighter, not really overextending himself. His stance is very sort of open and wide, just kind of moving around. Nothing terribly specific guard-wise. His blocks are very simple, nothing crazy there. But when it comes to him really putting the hurt on, he is putting his momentum forward, and it's always covering a decent amount of distance. And that kind of gets into the thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the Raider, is that I think the persona, if you will, that is unspoken about it is that the Raider is not looking for a one-on-one fight. He is very much looking for deal with this target, on to the next one. And the reason I think this is because, one, if we look at his movement once again, so when he's doing his general stance, his head is looking around, he's kind of tense, ready to do whatever he's going to do. He does check his back and things along those lines. When it comes to him using his movesets, again, they bring him forward. At any point, if he were to finish someone off with one of these heavy hits, he could just keep right on going for the next guy. We also see this kind of personified in the campaign and some of the earlier works. He's not doing anything fancy. He's just driving through whatever he fights, and if they go down, great. If they don't, he hits them again. So this also comes up in his executions, which we'll get to in a moment, but I think what it is that it shows he's not suited to being a duelist. Not that he can't duel, but for the most part, he's more worried about fighting en masse and getting to end goal, which is usually through, which is great for his namesake, Raider. When you're on the raid, usually you're dealing with people that were taken by surprise, / maybe not super trained fighters, or civilians, in which case, I'm not going to take time to individually square up with every single person I run into. I'm just gonna chop, and I'm gonna keep going. So I think that's what they were kind of getting at. We also see that in his charge. So when he goes out to try and grab people, he does it. He actually puts his axe in his left hand. He'll grab, lift, run them over, plop them down, and then you've got, of course, your heavy, or alternatively, he'll run them into a wall, ram them with the knee, and then you can continue on going. So some interesting use there, grabbing target and using it to basically run through lines of either enemy or what have you. It's unique, but again, there's that forward momentum, that kind of keep moving forward thing going on. Now, like I said, not a terribly diverse moveset to work through, but as I was going over the stuff, I kind of noticed that, and I don't think anyone's talked about it before, so I find it rather interesting. And it continues on into his executions and emotes, which is, emotes-wise, once again, Raider didn't really get a ton of love. Some of the stuff is cool. I mean, you've got basically the Tuscan Raider sort of thing, you've got, general that stuff, but what I find interesting is that the Raider's executions and emotes are all quite fast. I can't confirm if they're the fastest, but he doesn't have a ton of long ones, especially on the emote side. It's usually just, something like, ah! And then he's back into it, something along those lines. Especially the ones when he's in actual fight stance as opposed to just standing. When he's gone down into guard, essentially, a lot of these are very quick, I'm already moving around, there's an enemy I want to call out. As opposed to, for example, with the Kensai, it was very one-on-one, very I am acknowledging you, we're doing this, or when we get to the warden or stuff like that, it's usually a bit more formal. This, on the other hand, always kind of comes out as a challenge. It's always kind of a, I see you're wrecking my side, I want to call you out about it. So for example, he comes down to guard, he will do that number, more aggressive, you will see that kind of thing, and then just kind of straight back into guard. Again, things that aren't taking a ton of time. Or one of my personal favorites, he will kind of challenge with the flagpole. So all very quick, very easily done while there's chaos going on or what have you. And I think that really is supposed to be, the raider is this force of nature that is moving through whatever they're destroying. And if anyone catches his eye, as we see happen in the campaign, there's a quick call out and it's into the fight. Executions wise, so there are a bunch of different executions that the raider has. Most of them are actually quite simple. What I was surprised about going over the raider's executions again is that he doesn't do a ton of wrestling or striking compared to most of his Viking counterparts. Instead, he does do some very obviously strength-based things. For example, I can't make the axe stick to my back, but he will lift up, then bang his opponent and roll them off. He does have that, but for the most part, he tends to stick to just devastation with the axe, because that's his fastest, most lethal tool. So, for example, the kind of standard one, you finish off in this position pretty much, so a sort of forward guard. He will pull out, pop, and then boom, straight into the head, right back on the guard. Nothing crazy. Actually, wait, on that one I'm pretty sure he rips down and then brings it through. Other ones he will occasionally show, for example, there's one in which he will hit, he will withdraw, thrust, hammer into the back, and then hurl them off that way. So passing them off to the next guy. But overall, nothing terribly complicated so far. That one in particular I rather like because he keeps in a very sort of forward position and shows, boom, over the top. He actually does raise his legs slightly as he brings this momentum down, which is something we see in Paul Hector Meyer. And then they're gone. Other one I thought was notable was his axe uppercut. So in that case, he lands, he pulls back, and then as they're coming forward, just boom. Which I rather like how brutal that one looks. It's just got a lot of momentum to it, like I said. The only ones in which he gets kind of more complicated are the ones that started to give me this idea of, speed and always moving from one target to the next as much as possible. For example, on one of them, he hits the opponent, rips them down. They're now on their knees right about there. He smashes them in the side of the head with the top of his axe, and actually goes and looks somewhere else before noticing they're still alive, at which point he hooks, stretches, and kicks their head off, because he's strong. But there was that idea of he deals with the opponent very quickly, very simply, and is already looking for his next fight, then notices he hasn't finished the job, which is quite unique. The one that I love to do the most probably would be his decapitation. So he will hit, and what you're going to do is you're going to spin that way. So he will step out, rip in, no, it's the other way. Here, hang on a second. Here, rip, there it is. And as he steps through, it will plunk. And there's always that surprise when he finishes, because when he blows the axe through, so boom, rip, thunk, he looks back and actually kind of goes, okay. As though he wasn't necessarily expecting the axe to go all the way through, didn't even necessarily care. Just smashed the axe into the target with as much momentum as he could, and okay. The only one in which he does something particularly unique would be in the, I don't remember what it's called, but I believe it's called something Typhoon or Cyclone or something along those lines. After he lands his hit, he pulls it back and actually strikes them with the flat of his axe head to set up for him to hit harder will move back around them and chuck them off that way. Now, it's probably his most complicated execution because he covers so much distance. But what I found interesting about it is the fact that he takes that time to smack them with the flat to set up his hit into their belly, moves around his axe to then chuck them off that way. So I think in that case that's him sort of showing off. The Raider doesn't so much have a sadistic streak as he does sort of have a humor, I would say, with fighting. I mean, his lore is that the moment of a Viking's death is chosen, so what's the point of armor? As far as he's concerned, everyone he kills, that was their time to die, according to the gods. So I think he sees a sort of humor or camaraderie even in that when it comes to dealing with his opponents. He just finishes them off. If the hit was meant to kill him, the hit will kill him, which that sort of informs a little bit about his fighting style. Maybe I'm reading too deep into it, but that's kind of the point of this show. So overall, when it comes to Raider, nothing too complicated. Relatively simple, fast sort of fighter, conservative with his light hits, always committing with the more heavy side of things, and hit the target till it's dead and move on, which is exactly the same as pretty much you end up playing him. So, all in all, that's the Raider. Let's talk about our second for the day, which is going to be the Conqueror. Now, it just so happens that for doing the Conqueror, I have a flail. This flail is real. The chain, I would probably want a chain that was a little bit thicker if I was actually going to use this as a real weapon, but the head is about maybe 2 pounds, maybe even more, I don't know, of solid cast iron, it looks like, so this is about as real as it gets. Now, I do not have a heater shield, so in place of that, I'll be using my rotella, just for showing the guards. For the actual demonstration of what he does, I'm going to put the shield down so that you can see more of it. So, firstly, let's talk a little bit about the Conqueror's positions. He does wear a kettle helmet, which covers quite a lot, as well as a large pair of pauldrons usually. And for the most part, he just kind of keeps the flail held off to the side. There really isn't a great way to transport this thing. I mean, I can kind of bring it over my shoulder, but it's not very comfortable, and it's certainly not ready to go at any point. I mean, if I tried to flick this forward, it'd probably beam me in the back of the head, so I'm not necessarily interested in doing that. Instead, it's just kind of always held out to the side, usually about here. Now, position-wise, his guards are pretty simple, mostly dealing with where he puts his shield. He has his outside, his inside, and his top. Now, all these positions, honestly, makes total sense. I mean, here, he's very much giving only one opening. Here, a little bit less sense is made, and I'll talk about this again in a moment, but overall, not that crazy. And over the top, perfect sense with his helmet there as well. He's honestly pretty secure. Now, the thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to the inside guard, which I suppose I'll use the shield for, is when he blocks, for the most part, he just moves his shield into position. Nothing crazy. But every time he wants to swing the flail from his left side, he has, if he hasn't swung from the right already, he has to spin around, which the Conqueror has a unique ability, which is if you start your heavy in place of a parry, you can catch and then hit. Now normally this works out just kind of like so. You know, cut comes in, boom, bang, nothing crazy. Cut comes in, boom, bang, nothing crazy. However, when it comes to a cut coming in from this side, and your heavy going around, sorry, actually from that side, this was the side I meant. But anyway, when it comes to a strike coming in from that side, the block actually happens after he's already kind of turned. At first I thought maybe he's trying to actually turn to catch it this way before hitting, but he's not spinning fast enough for that. So instead, it looks like what he does is as the strike is coming in, he's taking it on the shoulder rather than on his shield before launching into his attack from that side. It's very strange, and I don't really have a good justifiable reason for it, but I noticed it and it seemed odd, so I thought I'd bring it up. Now, Put the shield down. Attacks and movement-wise, the Conqueror is pretty simple, and I think they did a really good job. It's not something you really appreciate until you actually get the chance to swing around one of these. And I will say this for certain, be careful. If the opportunity presents itself, this thing is really, really dangerous. I mean, it only has to bounce the wrong way and it's gonna hurt you a lot. So I'm gonna be taking this a little bit slower. But for the most part, he respects the weight of the flail quite well in his movement. I don't know what they had the mocap actors swinging, but certainly they did a good job kind of rendering out the idea that once this gets going, you really can't stop yourself. So for the most part, his swings are nothing crazy. He will spiral up by going forward with the hopes of bringing a descending hit. The only other time he swings from below is on his uppercut, but we'll come back to that. For the most part, all of his strikes are going to be coming from above. Now, the fun thing about that is that he has kind of an infinite, and honestly it's the light that most people will be using, which would be he will step and then backhand, and just kind of keep it flowing back and forth like this. Now, he, I believe, just keeps stepping forward. I'm stepping forward and backward because I don't want this to hit me in the leg. But, fun thing about using a flail, when you swing it from your dominant side, obviously your hand's going to be open. Most times when you cut with a sword, you would strike like this on the way back. With a flail, because it doesn't really have an edge of any sort, oftentimes I find myself basically doing like I was striking with a short edge, or even just with the back of my hand. It doesn't particularly matter. The momentum's already going in there, I don't really have to care. Now, the Conqueror mostly swings from his shoulder. Occasionally he'll spool up with the elbow, but for the most part it's going to be the shoulder, and he's using wide passing type of motions. So his infinite chain pretty much boom, 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 nothing crazy. When he swings from the top, he has to take a much wider step to the side so he doesn't belt his own legs, things along those lines. And really, nothing terribly different between his lights and his heavies, just he puts a little bit more force into when he swings his heavies, opens himself up a little bit more, and really steps through. Now, on the note of his uppercut, because I mentioned it already, when he does strike from below, the only time he does is after he's dropped down into his kind of all-blocking stance, in which case he just centralizes himself and moves the shield according to wherever the strike is coming in. However, if he times it right, he can strike and at the same time really give a belt from below. Now what that is basically all you're doing is you just set yourself into it. You block, step, and then twist it. Having twisted up your body, you just unfurl at a harsh upper angle. I would not want to get hit with that. Now it is important to note that on his, he actually lets the flail sort of come onto his shoulder and kind of bounce around here. I'm not doing that because there's a lot of momentum into this thing, and I really don't feel like breaking a hip. If I were wearing more armor, maybe I wouldn't care. I don't know. I've never really given it the time to consider if I had more armor on, how would I respond to this. Mostly I'd feel a little bit safer, to be honest. But the Conqueror, it should be pointed out, isn't wearing a ton of armor on his chest. He's mostly just wearing kettle, pauldrons, I think he has one elbow on, and kneecaps, basically. So, if one of these swings around and hits him with decent force, unless it hits something in front, probably still going to hurt. Anyway, though, the other sort of unique thing that the Conqueror will do is he will do his area attack. Now, his area attack is different than most people's. Most area attacks are going to be a series of strikes that then terminate after about 3 moves. The Conqueror instead can just sit there and keep himself protected as he swings around. Nothing too crazy here, pretty much. He just sets himself down and moves his body in conjunction with a horizontal swing coming from his right. Nothing crazy there. Other things the Conqueror does. The other kind of main thing, the thing everyone's used to, of course, is going to be his shield bash. In which case, all he does is just throw himself into it and smash someone in the center. Nothing crazy. So overall, toolkit-wise with the Conqueror, what can we kind of infer from him? Well, the thing I would say is that, much like the Raider, he seems to be someone who learned how to fight on the job more than anything else. Given his lore, he is a convict. All Conquerors are, so pressed into service. Why he was given a flail? I think the reason behind that is that, one, flails are kind of indicative of just cruelty and meanness. So I would have probably given him a bludgeon, because you put a bludgeon in someone's hands, you say to hit, they will hit. There's nothing more complicated required. You don't need to learn how to cut, you don't even really need to learn how to step. You just hit or you hit harder. The shield, of course, gives him a better survival chance while wearing less armor. So nothing terribly crazy there. His overall movement is pretty centered. He's got kind of the tough guy walk, things along those lines. Doesn't give us a ton of clue beyond that about his personality until we get to the executions mostly. So emotes-wise, of course, we got to do the famous one, Rah! Right? And then you can spam it and do all that sorts of fun stuff. But mostly, emotes-wise, it's pretty simple stuff. He'll mess around with his flail, do things of that nature. Nothing crazy. Now, when it comes to his executions, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. For the most part, they're pretty simple. Some of them he will strike and then set up for another hit. Two of them end up with him striking someone who he's either hooked their leg and pulled it out from and then strikes from above, or alternatively there's one where he strikes the knee and then with this momentum comes down to strike the head. Nothing crazy. I'm obviously not going to do this so I don't dent the floor. But there's also the ones where he instead goes for hooking and breaking. That's where things get a little bit more interesting. So, he's a criminal. We don't actually know what kind of criminal he is. And that's kind of a big chunk that's missing. Obviously, it's probably a case-by-case basis for most Conquerors, but as a criminal in the medieval and Renaissance periods, what crime you committed could very much determine how you died. For example, thieves. Not a lot of redeeming qualities in a thief, according to the medieval mind, were oftentimes hung, which is a very terrible way to die, as opposed to, a decapitation, which is seen as the much more merciful way to die because it's quicker. Whether or not it's quicker, I can't say. I haven't been decapitated or hung, nor do I intend to. The other most kind of horrible death you could get as a convict would be to be broken on the wheel, in which case you're either tied to a wheel or just, tied down to the ground, and someone beats you with iron bars to break all the bones in your limbs, and then they feed them through the wheel, and you're left out to die. It's rather horrific, once again. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the Conqueror, for a lot of his executions, specifically mimics that. On one of his first executions, and one of my favorites to date, he will, and I'll do this slowly because I obviously don't have anything to hook onto, he'll strike from the outside, causing his flail to hook around the person's neck. He will then step through, kick their leg out, and drop directly underneath them, pulling on the neck to cause it to break. Now, whether or not you could get someone's neck to break consistently with this, I don't know, but this is very much a kind of strangulation sort of technique. Also shows a little bit of sort of common wrestling in him, which is a cool thing to see. That little foot sweep, and then he very much sets himself not just down, he steps in behind his opponent to get right under his center of mass. So that's kind of cool to see. The other one in which is very obvious is he will rip the flail out, he'll once again hook it around the person's neck. This time he will drag them for a while, causing them great pain before finally stepping and managing somehow to rip their head off with just a chain. I don't know, Conqueror is swole according to most of his executions. But once again, and that one's even called the modified hangman. So, two, hanging style, indicative of, being a criminal. The other ones mostly deal with him first breaking a bone. One of them he hooks onto the outside of someone's arm, twists it over before, again, magically ripping the arm out of its socket. I think it would have been much cool if he just struck the elbow with the shield, something along those lines. Several of them he will smash with the shield either into the gut, into the face, into the knee, something along those lines. A couple of his strikes, he first hits a limb. Now, you could say this is practicality, but for the most part, considering if I've got this, all I really need to hit is the head, I think he's actively breaking as many bones with some of these executions as he can. To, once again, breaking on the wheel, another terrible way to die, which is something he'd be exposed to a lot if he was a criminal. The only ones where he gets more fancy than that would be, some of them he will wind up a little bit more and then step into it. There is one that I cannot do for sure, where he essentially does an over in front of him, behind him flourish before bringing it down, and that's about as complicated as he gets. For the most part, it's relatively simplistic. And like I said, I wish I could show these in more detail, but kind of bound by my materials. So, overall, Conqueror and Raider. Two strength-based characters, but there's a little more personality to them if you dig a little bit past the muscle. I think overall that Ubisoft did a very good job of showcasing strength meeting speed with these guys, because especially in regards to the Raider, he is very mobile, very fast, does a lot of quick actions. The Conqueror, on the other hand, very much respects the weight of his weapon when it comes to swinging, which is a really good thing to see in mocap, because as near as I can tell, for most parts, mocap is stuck with, almost as light as air objects. So to see that kind of thing being really taken into account is cool. But the Conqueror, without a doubt, shows a bit more of a sadistic side, and maybe even a little bit of, I'm free, but not really, so I'm going to take out what I'm afraid of on people that I am fighting. Which is kind of an interesting thing, and could probably delve deeper into, if you wanted to give your Conqueror more of a persona, maybe give him those specific executions. Versus the Raider tends to be mostly just, came here, hit that guy with an axe, didn't get back up, cool, where's the next one? So, overall, not too complicated on the movesets compared to the other ones we've done, but nonetheless, interesting character studies. So, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other movesets another time.